Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the nature and consequence of neoliberalism with the political scientist Wendy Brown.
What neoliberalism did over 40 years was create tremendously widening inequalities everywhere it touched down. And that means concentrated wealth at the top, and not just radical poverty at the bottom, but the slide of middle class and working class peoples in the global north as capital fled to the south, but as minimum wage regulations and unions and other protections of working and middle class ways of life were dismantled. Even the dismantling of effective schools, childcare, but also the dismantling of protection at the level of city services, ranging from provision of policing and fire services to ordinary neighborhood services, all become fee for use.
Does the eruption of ethno-nationalist movements defined by hyper-patriotism, xenophobia, racism, religious chauvinism, and so-called traditional moral values signal the end of neoliberalism? Or are these proto-fascist movements the natural consequence of neoliberal policies that allowed corporations to corrupt and seize governing institutions and the press, impoverish the working class, and orchestrate the largest transference of wealth upwards in American history? There is no doubt, as the political scientist Wendy Brown writes, that the constellation of principles, policies, practices, and forms of governing reason that may be gathered under the sign of neoliberalism has importantly constituted the catastrophic present. But, she argues, this was not neoliberalism's intent. Rather, its Frankensteinian creation. By generating anti-democratic forms of state power above, its natural consequence, she argues, was anti-democratic culture from below. The synergy between these two forces sees an increasingly undemocratic and anti-democratic citizenry ever more willing to validate an increasingly anti-democratic state. Joining me to discuss these issues is Professor Wendy Brown at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton and the author of In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. So let's begin with, you go back and look at the architects of neoliberalism, Hayek and others, and spend quite a bit of time dissecting what I would call the flaws in their economic theory. But I did find it, and I want you to speak a little bit about, because of course Hayek was kind of Margaret Thatcher's Bible. So speak a little bit about figures like Hayek. But then I found fascinating, what I think you argue correctly, that they didn't understand the political consequences of the economic systems they were implanting. But I'll let you begin from the beginning.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me. I think it's important to remember that neoliberalism is really born as a set of ideas, not just in response to the rise of socialism and social democracy in the West, and not just in reaction to what the neoliberals understood to be totalitarianism to the East, but also a response to fascism. They understood themselves as anti-fascists, and they aimed to design a political economy, but also a whole scope for the culture that would prevent fascism's return. And in this regard, what they believed was that placing freedom at the very heart of the economic system was one half of that, but the other half of it involved really rejecting what they understood to be the encroachments of ordinary democracy. That is, Hayek, Friedman, others saw that once you have the universal franchise, you're very likely to have a people who will start making bids for social justice, redistribution, state provision, legislation of all kinds that will actually generate more for them than a political economy left to its own devices would. And this is what they thought needed to be resisted because, according to Hayek and others, this is what would lead not only to disrupting the natural order, but also eventually to an overreaching, overweening state, a state that controlled the people and controlled power, when actually what should be left to the state is simply supporting the economy and supporting the moral order. So what they had in mind was a very depoliticized populace, democracy limited to nothing more than the peaceful transition of power, nothing more than simply voting and securing that vote, the outcome of that vote, and nothing like participation, legislation, and so forth. And Hayek formulated justice as simply that which involved universal rules for the applied universally, and that meant nothing that intervened in the social order. Social justice itself for them was the beginnings of creeping totalitarianism. So what you have in short is a understanding of what liberalism should be that radically limits its relationship to democracy and radically limits democracy itself. I go so far in the book as to argue that neoliberalism is really an explicitly anti-democratic project insofar as it's trying to limit what democracy can be to nothing more, as I said, than the peaceful transition of power, but also anti-democratic in the sense that it opposes any legislation that attempts to intervene in the outcome of the economy or the moral order. I keep mentioning moral order, and I'm just going to finish on this because most of our understanding of neoliberalism tends to focus exclusively on the economics. And what you see from reading Hayek and even Friedman and some of the other early neoliberals is that they are just as insistent that traditional morality is part of what organizes us in both a free and an orderly way. Free because we can subscribe to it or not, and orderly because it's evolved spontaneously over the years. And that also is a very big part of the neoliberal project.
In your book, you write, and you're writing about how the left views neoliberalism, and you say it goes roughly like this. In the global north, neoliberal economic policy devastated rural and suburban regions, emptying them of decent jobs, pensions, schools, services, and infrastructure as social spending dried up and capital chased the cheap labor and tax havens of the global south. Meanwhile, an unprecedented cultural and religious divide was opening. Hip, educated, slender, secular, multicultural, globe-trotting urbanites were building a different moral and cultural universe from the Midlanders whose economic woes were salted with steadily growing estrangement from the mores of those who ignored, ridiculed, and disdained them. More than hard up and frustrated, the Christian white, rural, and suburban dwellers were alienated and humiliated and left out and left behind. Then there was the enduring racism. But you argue that in some sense that these liberal political agendas, the abandonment, betrayal, ultimately rage on the part of the new possessed, the white working class, the first and second class worlds, was not the goal of the neoliberal architects.
That's right. The aim, of course, of neoliberalism, as I've described it already, is that you would end up with a very pacified citizenry, anything but enraged and anything but politically mobilized. They also aimed to get demagoguery out of politics and instead to have the political state simply be that which, with a very light hand, supported the market and supported the moral order. So what they got instead, in the form of Bolsonaro, Trump, Brexit, Orban, Erdogan, the rest of it, was something quite different. Social movements with tremendous amounts of rancor, right-wing rage, and a very manipulable but also highly vocal and mobilized citizenry, and that was absolutely antipathy. That's the fascism that the neoliberals were trying to avoid. They wanted a neutralized population, one that was preoccupied with taking care of itself, which is, of course, what Thatcher herself tried to build over a couple of decades, a population that was not politically involved and didn't make political demands, but simply took responsibility for its own existence. Instead, we got all of these highly mobilized right-wing forces with demagoguery at the top, and that's exactly the fear that the neoliberals had, that they were trying to avoid. Why did it come out of neoliberalism?
So how did
in part because
you call it a monster? Its founders
yes.
would abhor.
Yes, well, they made a mistake, I dare say, similar to the one that those who followed Marx made, which was to radically underestimate the perdurance of political power. They also made a mistake in underestimating the ability to get power out of the economy and to get the economy out of power. That is to say, they aimed at a separation between capitalism and the state, in which the state would simply support capitalism, but not be manipulated or maneuvered by it. Because they understood you didn't want national socialism. You didn't want the fusion of economics and politics, because that way lies totalitarianism. So what they didn't anticipate, of course, was the extent to which plutocracy could grow out of neoliberalism, the extent to which autocracy could grow out of neoliberalism, and the extent to which a massively enraged, displaced citizenry could rise up and make the very demands that they were trying to eliminate with a neoliberal order.
So the consolidation of capital, by its nature, in every society, going back to ancient Greece and the rise of empire, the consequence is always the crushing of the demos, the Greek term for the small city democracy. And this eradicates, you write, the political equality because it creates both in economic and then ultimately political exclusions and privileges, extreme social economic disparities, uneven or managed access to knowledge, that these are the inevitable consequences of unregulated, unfettered capitalism. Talk a little bit about how that quote-unquote free market essentially worked to corrode and destroy democratic institutions.
It's a big question, and I answer it differently across.
You know, Wendy, we're gonna come back to that question after the break.
Okay.
When we come back, we will continue our conversation about the rise of anti-democratic politics with Professor Wendy Brown. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about the ruins of neoliberalism and its consequences with Professor Wendy Brown. So before the break, I asked this question of how the unfettered, unregulated market, once it was unleashed, had a corrosive effect on democratic institutions and democratic participation. Can you explain that process?
So I answer that question in two different ways across two different books, and I actually stand by both answers still. So let me briefly reprise both. In a prior book, Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, which is now about 6 years old, I argued that the way that neoliberalism undermined democracy was essentially by corroding its terms, its culture, and its very value. That what neoliberalism does is unleash market values and market measures everywhere, from personal life to cultural life to political life. And, this no longer needs explaining. Everybody experiences it all the time. We all know that branding and entrepreneurialization and creating essentially the shareholder value of whatever you are doing, including your own show, is constantly with every entity large and small, from human beings to nonprofits to to corporations. So that corrosion of democratic values by the expansion of the economic is one effect of neoliberalism, and it's a very important one. But another effect of neoliberalism is to actually directly challenge the value of legislated, deliberated solutions to social problems, as opposed to leaving everything to the spontaneous orders, as Hayek put it, of markets and morals. And that's another kind of challenge. That's the more explicit political challenge. Democracy is bad, markets and morals are good. So you see this in every aspect of the right today, the challenge to things like Black Lives Matter, the challenge to racial justice more generally, the challenge to gender justice, to reproductive rights. All of those are built on the idea that moral orders, our inherited moral orders, more adequately or accurately comport us together than legislated interventions into how we should act, how we should distribute things, and so forth. So that's the other side of neoliberalism's challenge to democracy, the constant valorization, let's put it that way, of markets and morals, and devaluation of democratic or legislated solutions. Now we have an even stronger attack on democracy that has been generated by that, which is the very explicit one that we're seeing not only in the United States, but many other countries, where the attempt to dismantle democratic institutions and or challenge democratic outcomes in favor of authoritarian or autocratic ones, or we could simply say corrupt or stolen ones, has become rather normalized. And I also want to suggest that you can't entirely hold neoliberalism responsible for this, but it certainly plowed the ground. The general attack on democracy and devaluation of democracy that it produced has made people who might in other eras have been very sensitive to the loss of democratic institutions and values pretty much indifferent to them. And you know, we saw this in the general appreciation of Trump as well, that the indifference to his anti-democratic moves on every level was usually followed by, look, he's a successful businessman. He must be doing something right. And that sentence, that conjoining tells you a lot, that the indifference to the attacks on democracy in favor of the appreciation of his success as a businessman, or at least as an accumulator of wealth, had become the new value.
Yeah, although the attacks on democracy go all the way back. We can go to Reagan, but certainly with the Patriot Act, the Authorization to Use Military Force Act, Barack Obama's misuse of the Espionage Act, the exposures of wholesale surveillance by Edward Snowden, and then the refusal on the part.
And we can go back even further to the Electoral College and the Senate and gerrymandering and so forth. I mean, we can go back to the beginning. It's not as if attacks on democracy are recent. What I'm suggesting is they were put on steroids by neoliberalism and made broadly legitimate rather than relatively covert and under the table.
I mean, the funny part is that the neoliberals are good Marxists in the sense that they believe in the withering away of the state. A naive notion, I think, on both by Marx and the neoliberals. One of the points you make in the book that I found really interesting, and that is that by creating an anti-democratic culture above, you had a mirroring kind of effect where there was the spawning of an anti-democratic culture below. What was the cause of that? Why did the creation of these anti-democratic policies, why was the reaction below an embrace of anti-democratic ethos?
So I actually put the problem a little differently, which is that I think neoliberalism rolls out both. It rolls out anti-democratic culture at the political level, and at the same time, its attack on the social. Its attack on the very concept of the social. Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society, only individual men and women, and then she added, and their families. And that more general attack on the very idea of society as opposed to simply individuals and their entrepreneurial selves, is part of what creates that anti-democratic culture from below. So my argument is actually that both are happening simultaneously. The one doesn't cause the other. That said, obviously, the more anti-democratic our institutions become, including our ostensibly democratic institutions, Supreme Court as an example, but the presidency too, the Senate, the more they simply turn into hardball power politics, the less modeling of democracy we have, and the less surprising it is that there's a general failure to even know what it is, let alone believe in it, on the part of the masses. So I take your point that there's something that happens from above that is then trickles down and taken up from below. But I also think the anti-democratic force of neoliberalism happens at the level of dismantling society and casting us as mere entrepreneurs of ourselves, increasingly reliant only on ourselves, not only not on states, but also not on social fabrics, not on safety nets, but also not on anything beyond the self and the family that is its slight extension.
You talk about the dethronement of, in particular, the white working class, and you highlight this as an important element of the rage that we see among Trump supporters, the far right. We saw it on January 6th. Can you talk about that idea of dethronement?
One thing I think that's become fairly widely known, certainly by your audiences, is that what neoliberalism did over 40 years was create tremendously widening inequalities everywhere it touched down. And that means concentrated wealth at the top, and not just radical poverty at the bottom, but the slide of middle class and working class peoples in the global north as capital fled to the south, but as minimum wage regulations and unions and other protections of working and middle class ways of life were dismantled. Even the dismantling of effective schools, childcare, but also the dismantling of protection at the level of city services, ranging from provision of policing and fire services to ordinary neighborhood services, all become fee for use. As each of these things happens, what happens is incomes become frozen and more income becomes dedicated, obviously, to providing what used to be provided socially or politically. There's no better example in the United States than higher education. When you and I were young, it was possible essentially for free to attend high quality public universities. At this point, that's obviously out of the question. We have an indebted student class, but that debt also redounds back to the families that those students come from, in the sense that families themselves have to make decisions about whether they can even afford college for their kids. So all of this means a slide, and it means at the same time a population that is increasingly available to manipulation by something that in the United States and the UK, the right wing did very, very effectively, which was to take that disappointment, to take that decline in standard of living and blame it on immigrants and racial minorities. And that has been going on, of course, in the United States for a good 45 years. And again, the effects of neoliberalism meant that there was a larger and larger population available to that kind of rage and resentment and rancor that the GOP seeded so powerfully, so effectively. And then, of course, social media, Fox, et cetera, took it up a notch.
Great. That was Professor Wendy Brown on her book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West.